about parties and interest groups. This is covered in Chapter 6. There is a lot of material here. I'm just going over some of the highlights. I'm also going over a little material that is not discussed in the book, just adding to your information, a little context. There's some information presented in the book that has been some questions raised about it, not about the book per se, but about different theories. So I'm just trying to flesh out the presentation a little bit of the information. We're talking about interest groups and political parties in this chapter. They are related topics, but distinct, as we have the definitions presented in the book. Political parties organize groups of individuals that support, nominate, and run candidates for office, and interest groups. Interest groups are seeking to influence those who are elected to office on behalf of specific companies and causes. So they're related, but distinct, right? Political parties are organized to get the people into office. Once they're in office, the interest groups are trying to affect their behavior, their positions, the laws that they support, etc. When we talk about political parties, the thing to keep in mind is a lot of times people who are new to studying political science don't recognize that the parties that we have today do not have necessarily static positions. What we know today is the Democratic Party originally was called the Democratic Republican Party. How's that to confuse you? And dates back to Thomas Jefferson, who was elected president in 1800. So, been around for a while. At that stage, obviously, the Democratic Party was not associated with civil rights, for example. There was no such thing as civil rights, really. It was associated with small farmers. Republican Party didn't exist at that point, right? The first president elected under the Republican Party ticket is Abraham Lincoln in 1860. And the Republican Party at that point becomes identified with the abolition of slavery. And so one of the things that confuses people sometimes is that positions change, right? So we have Republican Party being the party that's associated with the abolition of slavery, essentially a northern party of big bankers and abolitionists. The Democratic Party, especially after the Civil War, is of immigrants and people in the South, Southerners, right? That flips once we get to the modern civil rights era, beginning, about 1960 or so, actually earlier, with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and in his administration back in the beginning in the 30s and the 40s, actually starting to introduce some measures for civil rights. He's a Democrat. That continues under Truman, for example, issuing an executive order to desegregate the armed forces. And then Kennedy, JFK, starting the ball rolling as far as desegregating public services, and accelerates with the Johnson, LBJ, and this is so that there was a reaction to that, especially in the South. The Southerners, who had been Democrats, object to the desegregation, and come 1968, the Southern strategy of Richard Nixon is very successful. And basically, the South flips to the Republican Party. So now we have states that had been Democratic, such as Texas, for example, now solidly Republican. When does that happen? It happens. It is associated with the civil rights era. That is what really one of the key factors that changes the orientation in the states. And this is state and local government. So we're talking about the state, the orientation of state parties. How do they come down, right? So there's the key thing to remember is that the parties do not have static positions. They don't change. Most of the time, they don't change quickly. Right now, many political scientists would say we're in a time of changing identities in the political parties in the United States. The Republican Party had been a party of free trade, for example, for decades, very much in favor of free trade across, globalization, you might say. Under President Trump, the Republican Party has shifted positions and it's become much more identified with protectionism. And we see some of this happening nowadays, playing out in the news. So modern day politics is increasingly candidate-centered. We mentioned President Trump. This is a very good example of someone who is elected very much on his own campaign, his own identity. Sometimes people who are new to the study of political science look at the statement that the United States has a weak party system, and they don't understand that. They say, well, how can that be? The Republican Party is so big. They have millions of dollars, and the Democratic Party is so big. What does that mean? What that means is that the parties per se don't have a lot of influence over the candidates who are running. They can support them, sure. They can, try to discourage different candidacies, but they don't have actual institutional control over the positions of different candidates running under that candidate. So the Donald Trump, when he was a candidate, didn't have to go to the Republican Party and say, hey, I'm going to take this or that position. I'd like to run this by you. Can I get your approval? He didn't do that. He didn't have to do that. Likewise, the woman who was elected recently to Congress from New York didn't have to go to the Democratic Party and say, hey, I'm talking about my identity and thinking about a democratic socialism and how do you feel about this? No, she didn't have to do that because the United States has a weak party system, and increasingly nowadays the politics in this country is candidate centered. Well, you can look around anywhere. Cynthia Nixon is running for governor. Is running for governor in New York State. She's a celebrity. Arnold Schwarzenegger in California. These are examples of candidate-centered politics. There are pros and cons of this. Many people would say that this leads to people being elected who are not necessarily experienced in the actual task of governing. They may have other attributes, but they aren't experienced in governing. Nonetheless, that's where we are. when we talk about U.S. politics, there's a lot of attention to swing voters. This is kind of self-evident. These are voters who can shift either way. They're undecideds, right? A lot of attention goes into courting these people. The reality is, in recent years, especially in the last election, that the people who are undecided are actually they represent an increasingly small portion of the electorate. This is a natural consequence of our increasingly hyper-partisan system, where people are very firmly in one camp or the other. Most people would say this is one of the challenges that the political system in the United States faces, is that we have a situation where there is not enough dialogue, middle ground between political opponents and people who are undecided. Many of you might be, in fact, firmly in one camp or another, and you might, your groups of friends likewise might be sorted out that way. This is a relatively recent phenomenon in U.S. politics. This has not always been this way. So people may. The funny thing, and again, this can be kind of confusing because, as your book points out, there's an increasing number of Americans classifying themselves as independents. They might classify themselves as independents because maybe that makes them feel good. Say, I'm independent. We all like to think we're independent thinkers. But in fact, studies have shown that the people who classify themselves as independent, in fact, reliably support one of the parties, consistently. They're independent. What does that mean? That means if you're not registered with a party, that means you don't participate in that party's primary. You have no say in choosing who is running for that party. So, for example, in Illinois, for example, there's a guy running under Republican who is self-identified Nazi. He denies the existence of the Holocaust. He won the primary for the Republican Party. People who are not registered Republicans could not vote against him. So in this particular case, there is a Holocaust denier running on the Republican ticket in Illinois, because no one stood up to run against him, and he was elected. So just because you are not registered with the party doesn't mean that you necessarily you flip randomly between those parties. In general, what studies have shown is that those independents do, in fact, support one party or another reliably in the general election. They just don't vote in the primary. There's a theory that your book goes into, and this has been around since the 1960s, called the responsible party model. What does a model mean? A model is a short sort of description about how theorists think things operate. I emphasize the word theorists, not the word theory. That in this case, the theory is that political parties offer clear policy choices to voters, and then the parties deliver on those policies or don't, and then the parties are held accountable. And this is sort of an argument for political parties. I feel obliged to mention that, in fact, there's some controversy about how realistic this model is. Just about a year ago, there's a book that came out with considerable fanfare and expressed a lot of interest in the political science community, called Democracy for Realists by Christopher Aiken and Larry Bartels, both very highly regarded political scientists. And their research cast doubt on this responsible party model for a number of reasons. One of the things they point out is that in this democratic system, most citizens are ill-informed and uninterested in politics. They might live in something called a democracy. That doesn't mean that they really participate in it. They're too preoccupied in their own private lives to get involved. And maybe this applies to some of you. And even if they did get involved, the accountability of the parties to the voters is limited. For one thing, the voters don't necessarily have the information that they need to hold the parties accountable. And that, in fact, most voters are casting their votes based on partisan loyalties or group loyalties, and it really doesn't matter about whether particular policies were in fact produced or not. And finally, the perception of reality, perception of how effectively those policies were implemented or not, is heavily influenced by those party preferences. One of the things that we like to think is that, well, I'm following, candidate A because his beliefs reflect my own. That may be true, but the other side of that equation that sometimes doesn't get enough attention is that, and research has borne this out, is that we shift our views to fit with the people that we're supporting. So candidate A says that, this or that policy is acceptable. I think that we should, we should paint all barns blue. And you'd never really thought about painting all barns blue before, and in fact you prefer red. But you've put your faith in candidate A, and suddenly you're thinking, well, that guy's got a good point, and yeah, maybe he's right, and I'm going to shift my opinions to match those of the guy or the gal that I'm supporting. So this is another factor that often doesn't get acknowledged by people who are thinking about, well, I'm a Republican because that party matches my beliefs, or I'm a Democrat because it matches my beliefs. In fact, people shift beliefs to match those of the leader as well. It's not a one-way street. When we talk about this whole shifting of opinions, obviously the impact of information is key, and the importance of the media is essential in any sort of country that would call itself a democracy. It's really difficult to imagine a democracy without an independent media. I teach an entire class on this. I urge you to sign up for it it's Politics 103. But one of the things that, again, sort of a misconception that people have is that the media is so biased today. Well, that might or might not be true. But what is certainly true is that a the media has a long history of bias in this country. In fact, that the media system began as a bias system, began with a partisan bias. They were set up as the newspapers set up as partisan newspapers. That shifts when the funding for newspapers becomes dependent on advertising, and obviously to sell ads, it's you want to be selling ads to Republicans and to Democrats, right? So you're going to be taking a policy position down the middle. So we have the development of more or less non-biased media that has become the media has become, certainly cable news has become much more partisan in recent decades. That's a whole nother discussion. Some of the factors behind that, but it is definitely a factor that we have in the hyperpartisanship we see today. Again, talking about political parties and their evolution in the 1800s, beginning, really the key player here in the development of the patronage politics was President Andrew Johnson. This is called patronage. In other words, you support me in my run for office, and I will give you a job, right? And that's how politics worked in the early 1800s into the middle 1800s. There's some problems with this. You get people holding jobs for which they are completely unqualified. And this was certainly the case with Andrew Johnson. You have this coming to a head, and in the late 1800s, and the Pendleton Act is first proposed legislation to create a civil service is proposed and finally is passed after the assassination of President Garfield, assassinated by a frustrated office seeker, thought he should get a job and didn't get the job, and so he killed the president. Right, that galvanized people into action, and we have the passage of the Pendleton Act of 1883. Patronage is often associated with political corruption. One of the interesting things in your textbook is this map of political corruption in the states. You'll see it varies pretty widely. So there might be some surprise. I was surprised actually to see that Nevada is rated as low as it is, because it's not necessarily self-explanatory. Again, we talk a lot in this class about political culture, and so how does that connected with political corruption? You might think about that, right? Political corruption works when people aren't involved, for one thing, and are not engaged in the political process. Again, part of the things, one of the complications about teaching this class is that there's so much variation. So when we talk about political parties, you see that the existence of nonpartisan ballots varies a lot from state to state. And that really is an individual question, right? About how the issue of the elections are dealt with. Remember, states have the primary responsibility for running the elections. The parties in general are, regulated differently. This is something that it's hard to generalize about. In most places, we have candidates chosen by primary elections. That's a relatively, it's a development of the 19th century. It used to be that candidates were chosen, all chosen at party conventions. Now it's a little bit more open. Things are being done at the ballot box. The cool thing, as I think I mentioned earlier about this class, is that you have the ability to get involved and to get familiar with the operations of state and local politics in a way that you can't at the federal level, not easily, right? So, in fact, your local party, whether Democratic or Republican or Green, there are some other political parties out there aside from the big two, have regular meetings. They have, for example, in Washington County, we have a central committee for the Republican Party and for the Democratic Party. And those officers are chosen in the primary election. So Maryland just had its primary on the 26th of June, and new members were elected for both parties. By law, they have to have open meetings, and you can attend these meetings. I urge you to do so. We can, if you contact me, I can tell you how to get a hold of people in these parties. In general, when we talk about elections, there's obviously the general election, primary election. Primary elections are closed or open. So if they're closed, it means that if you are a Democrat, then you can vote in the Democratic election, but you can't vote in the Republican election. Open primaries are different. Again, it means that you don't have to be registered Republican or Democrat. There is currently a lot of talk about changing the way that we have primaries, so that to reduce the level of hyperpartisanship that we see nowadays. One of the key factors in running the elections, running campaigns, is that the limits to campaign spending were more or less lifted by the Supreme Court in recent years. The key case that comes up is the Citizens United case. Citizens United in 2010, the Supreme Court finds that the Supreme Court prohibits government from restricting independent political expenditures by corporations and unions. Now, of course, corporations have a lot more money than unions, so this primarily benefits the very large corporations. It's called Citizens United because there's a conservative group called Citizens United that wanted to run a film that would have violated the McCain-Feingold Act, sort of colloquially called the McCain-Feingold Act, formerly called the Bipartisan Campaign Finance Reform Act. No, it is bipartisan. McCain is a Republican, Feingold's a Democrat. So the bottom line is, with this court decision, the limits on campaign financing are removed, and we have the exponential growth in campaign financing. I include here a couple of quotes one from a justice who, he actually wrote the opinion, Justice Anthony Kennedy, who just retired. He said that he supported his decision by saying, that, if let's just say you own stock in Coca-Cola, and Coca-Cola is campaigning for somebody or giving money to a campaign that you don't like, well, then you have the ability to write to Coca-Cola and say, hey, I don't like this, and also that the citizens will be able to see who's making the campaign donations, um, and that they'll make an informed decision. Now, of course, try to remember this about how involved in real life people are in tracking campaign finances. Do we really pay attention to who's paying the bills for that campaign ad that we see? Is that really realistic? The dissenting opinion, strong dissent, written by Justice Stevens, as he put it, that the ruling, quote, threatens to undermine the integrity of elected institutions across the nation. The path it has taken to reach its outcome will, I fear, damage this institution. He's talking about the institution of the Supreme Court. A democracy cannot function effectively when its constituent members believe laws are being bought and sold. So his concern is that laws, that these people, making unlimited campaign donations are, in appearance at least, buying laws, buying policy. And that if people believe this, that is, if its constituent members, in other words, if the electorate believe this, then they aren't going to participate. You're not going to be as trusting in the process, because it's going to lead to increasing cynicism about what does it matter. The big companies are in charge. It doesn't really matter how I vote, because they're pulling the strings. So this Citizens United really has reshaped politics in the United States, and I want to emphasize this is at the state and local level too, because when Citizens United came down, it meant that all the states that had their own limits on financing, those limits went out the window as well. So there was Montana, for example, used to have limits on outside funding sources for campaigns, because of their concern about big mining interests from outside the state, influencing campaigns. Those laws went out the window because of Citizens United. So all that said, we have the regulation happening at the state level. They run the elections. They regulate the elections. We do have competition in the across the states, but oftentimes in the states the competition's pretty limited, right? In many states. So we have states that are so reliably Republican or Democrat that the competition between the parties is not all that strong. We do have to address the question of third parties and independents. The United States operates under what is called a majoritarian system. It's a little confusing. It means, for one thing, that we have a pluralist system of elected candidates. What does that mean? It means that you can get elected not with a majority, but with just a plurality. In other words, just because you have more votes than anybody else. So we had an election, let's just say, with 3 candidates, and you could get elected with 35% of the vote, right? Now, majority of the electorate, in that case, opposes you. That doesn't matter. You have the plurality. So we have a majoritarian system, which means that the majority is given outsized, that is disproportionate influence in making policy, right? I think your book points calls it sometimes called first past the post or single member district, right? So we have I'm a resident of Washington County. We have, and my congressman is John Delaney in 6th Congressional District. We had an election, right? In the last election was not all that close, but there was one election where it was relatively close, right? So let's just say the Republican that something like 48%, well, 49% voted for the Republican. Well, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. There were more votes for the Democrat in that case, right? Does that mean that Republicans get, let's just say, 49% of the impact on policy? No. They don't even get a broom closet in the Capitol, right? The office goes to the person who won the election. So this is the, what some people would say, the drawback for the system that we have is that it does not allow enough power or policy influence on the people who are not winning the election. It stands opposed to what the other system would be called a proportional system of representation. But we have a system where the third party, because of this, the third parties and independents have very limited ability to have any influence at all. This is because of sometimes it's summarized in something called Duverger's law, that means basically that third parties almost never win elections in a single member district. So their ability, they might influence agenda down the road, they might bring up issues, but they don't actually win elections. What does influence policy are interest groups and lobbies. So especially with the Citizens United, we have increasing power for these interest groups and lobbies. There are, you should be clear on the difference between the contract lobbyists and the cause lobbyists, right? So we have contract lobbyists who are basically the hired guns, right? And then you have cause lobbyists. You might have environmental groups like the Sierra Club, for example, or what have you, that are lobbying on a specific cause. At the state and local level, I think that it's important to recognize that these groups can have a lot of impact. It's at least arguable that they have more impact at the local level. Why? For one thing, because there's not as much attention paid. The national media has a lot of resources and pays a lot of attention to who's contacting whom up in Washington. But at the local level, a lot of work goes on out of sight. And especially nowadays, the local media, that is the local newspapers, don't have the resources to have a reporter in the state capitol. So that sort of lobbying goes on unnoticed. One example of this, I'll just as a example of very effective lobbying, is this group called ALEC. ALEC is the American Legislative Exchange Council, made up of very large corporations, Peabody, Pfizer, the Koch brothers, AT&T. They write legislation that is then introduced at the state level. They've been behind efforts to get policy, to basically push policy through at the state level that have benefited very large corporations in the last few decades, and a lot of their work has gone on out of sight. They didn't really, no one was really paying attention to them until a few years ago, um, when the Stand Your Ground laws got some scrutiny down in Florida, and people realized that where did these laws come from? Well, they came from ALEC. They came from large corporations, in this case, for one thing, gun manufacturers, that were pushing particular legislation through. So they have pushed through legislation about voter ID laws, cut money for public education, limiting the liability that corporations have in court, classifying any sort of exposing of animal cruelty as terrorism, cutting sick leave for workers. These are all areas where ALEC has been very successful at the state level at pushing legislation through. They have essentially written the legislation, and then it gets put before the state legislators, who then approve it. This is how what often happens with lobbyists. This is nothing unique to ALEC in that way. That's how, especially at the state level, that a lot of legislation is written by the lobbyists, and then it is passed. So it's something to be aware of, that when we're talking about lobbyists and the power of lobbyists, interest groups, this is at least as important at the state and local level as it is at the national level. So, what can we say in conclusion? There's a lot in this chapter. Make sure you're familiar with all the terms listed at the end of the chapter. Recognize that when we're talking about political parties, not only has the role changed of political parties, but the identities and the policy positions of the different parties has changed. Make sure you're familiar with how interest groups work and some of the key factors in their success, such as Citizens United, and be aware of the role of state regulation in how the election process actually is implemented.